art in the most fundamental way.
I would like to talk about loss in relation to the digital, and in particular, digital moving image. Different kinds of loss will get confused in this brief talk. Psychological, corporeal, the deliberately spurned, the unknowably gone. Loss will be apprehended both literally and figuratively, oftentimes in a welter of the two. I'm going to lean most heavily on a psychoanalytic figuration and a mortal existential literalism of loss. Two of the limits of loss's sense and its effect. In talking through some of this, I hope to sketch a particular kind of ethics of literality and figuration, with an emphasis on how these two modes are at work in the digital moving image. I should say that loss, also here, should be understood in the possessive, as in all of what follows is inscrutably caveated by autobiography. So the title of this talk is Losslessness. Loss's cybernetically bred correlative. Losslessness, in all its clunkily appended vernacular, refers to a category of data compression algorithm that allows original data to be perfectly reproduced. The term, losslessness, part abstracted, implicitly invites a mistaking of technology's progression with a fantasy of immortality. Built-in obsolescence prosaically confused with death, with loss proper. Losslessness explicitly pertains to an economic and material limitlessness regarding the possible reproducibility of a digital thing. But it also speculates an end to loss as a precondition of everything. Speculates because losslessness is conjectural and hyperbolic. Outside of its disinterested tech lexicon, a relabeling of loss. Empirically, losslessness is some kind of paradoxical annexation of loss. Is itself always already lost to experience, is simply another category of loss. Literal empiricism, however, is an ever more rarefied possibility. Contemporary digital reproduction's persistent demonstration of a lossless material promise sufficiently ironizes loss's hegemony over the inevitable, and of course over experience's veracity. Particularly when reality's already dubious actuality has become so fantastically subtended by the digital, enough to shift loss's proximity to material, personal loss. Loss, felt, gets repressed at a clip equivalent to the refresh rate of infinite reproduction, dissembling loss through an immortal figuration, and with it those things that might previously have been mourned. Loss, in the technological and specifically digital sense, has all but shrugged off its etymological, physical forebears. Like other digitally reborn terms, such as rendering, capturing, processing, etc., loss is a negative effect of a now welcomely obsoleted failure of tech. Losslessness is a solution to a problem concocted inside of the language and its particular technological semiology, a kind of problem modeled coolly according to some secessional capitalistic paradigm, rendered a weird sort of natural, a kind of evolution as inbuilt obsoletism, a disinterested suspension, as if of insuperable nature apart. Such disinterest steeps seeming technological straightforwardness too, saturating not just its lexicons but also our presumption concerning the innateness of its processes. It's a sleight of hand that conflates capitalism's waveform of progress and dissimulates certain desires and meanings behind planned obsolescence, differentiated from, say, the evolution of Galapagos finches. Insofar as it sticks evolutionary process with the motives of design, technology's natural world has a distinctly creationist hue, a tack that could be the MO of certain consumer products. User-friendliness, more often than not, pervades in order to maintain ignorance, and is engaged in economically justified mollification. The kind of capitulation that a spiritualistic natural world might apparently ethically urge needs either some sort of heuristic detachment or otherwise a comfortingly justifiable disregard of material and mortal experiences and experiences and consequences of loss, in our example. In a so-called natural order of things, technology is enthralled to other larger celestial movements, And this means that left uninterrupted, in due course, it's liable to be straightforwardly disposed of, according to the logic of whatever capitalistic progress, at the altar of obsolescence and its erroneous determination as natural and the apparent way things are. On these terms, mortality confers only the loss of value and timely replacement. Mortality here is a pejorative, or a violence allegorized, even as it burlesques the truly mortal by pertaining to inevitability. And this symbolic violence divests mortality of a great slew of attendant undertakings: care, mourning, intimacy, affective recognition, all of which are in direct correspondence with mortality, but only if mortality is understood as ontological, only if mortality is a condition of life rather than of economic process, and only if understood literally rather than figuratively. So the relationship between the literal and the figurative is fraught. A given literal meaning is more often than not in disagreement, if not political conflict, with the figurative meaning. This paradoxical inherence is rehearsed at every stage of the videos that I make, and is at the heart of my practice's attempt at a document of the digital, its attempt to encounter and afford the paradoxes of the medium and its seeming contingencies in order to better propose how it might break or resolve misplaced ironies and dissimulations, in turn to affirm a kind of proper application of literality and of figuration. In my videos, I want to make conspicuous my attachment to the vicissitudes of technologies that describe the work's limits, to make conspicuous the necessity of any technologically incumbent artist's glistening new attachment to their chosen medium. An artist's first approach to some glistening new tech may be to cleave to the edge of that tech, to trace its perimeter in order to figure whatever aspect ratios or resolutions and all the other hindering apparatuses of apparent AV fidelity as determinedly literal. This for the purposes of exposition, initially, and for the particular elucidatory pleasures of finitude, latterly. And in so doing, an artist might be seen to be kind of incorporating tech, as in making it corporeal, analog, mortal, taking it in, moving towards the world with a Freudian lope, sadistically, preemptively, these subject-object relations seemingly built entirely around sadism's hegemony as relation, a presumed preventative feint, just to be sure. So this literality regarding a technology's limits is a rebuttal of the desires of the tech, its apparent correct usage, and at the other end, its specialist unpacking. The artist's relationship to the use of a piece of technology whose complexity makes its parameters far more restricted than, say, a pencil, is to reject the very idea of correct use. And because so many of the desires of a technology relate to upholding its inconspicuousness, one of the first things an artist might do when wielding it would be to retrieve the technology from whatever quagmire of figuration in which it had sequestered itself. Whether that figurative hiding place is representational verisimilitude or similarly disappearance from the field of view by extreme intimacy or extimacy to its user, the technology constantly seeks to be lost. The consumer-grade portion of tech finds some figured endophytic relation to its user, whereas the specialist piece of kit is figured as alien, sometimes state-level alien, like the military or mega industry or outer space or whatever other intangible. It is perhaps hyper-objectivized, pushed to a point of irretrievable unwieldiness. The exponential growth of these relations is cybernetics proper, even if for me it's perhaps more appositely considered through the mutable lens of psychoanalysis. To reiterate and to be clear, loss is our exemplar. Both of those poles of proximity, consumer and specialist, vanish the tech to the general populace, certainly to ideological ends, but also for more convoluted reasons as regards any consequential relation. As in, the tech's vanishing is part of a maintenance of a fantasy of holism, coherency, or perhaps the loss of the tech obtains the seeming maintenance of the ego and the ego's correctly deluded place, hierarchically speaking. Correct usage, as regards a piece of technology, is a pragmatic normality that bleeds out into ideology, social determinism, and so on. So an artist might first set out to find a technology, or rather the artist might first understand a technology as lost. This finding is obviously cast metaphorically, although there is, relatively speaking, a movement towards the literal in this retrieval. If unacknowledged absence is the precondition of technology's successful ebb, then the figurative act of finding is at least a literal act of making present. In this account, technology proper is always already lost, and by disingenuous design. Ignorance is a kind of pall to appease guilt. So the subject bypasses the need for the object by regarding it as a loss beyond the reach of the self. The subterranean of the tech, its reality, is apparently beyond impactful range. The loss is never understood, simply repressed. Insofar as the lost object becomes internalized through its dissimulation, the relationship is neurotic, according to Freudian psychoanalysis. We could turn this up, by the way, just a bit. Thank you. In most cases where the ethics of corporate industry, factory conditions, state violence, environmental horror, political doctrinarism, etc., are known, and this really is most of the time, if not at least suspected all of the time, the conspicuously oblivious loss of technology is entirely desirable in order to repress the trauma of the technology's fact. This kind of imperative repression, imperative in order to function coherently according to all kinds of vast contractual mores, creates a kind of aimless melancholy or shame, an awful disinterested shrug laps at the melancholic. In contrast, acknowledging the lost object sets in motion a shift from melancholy to purposive mourning, and by example, acknowledging the bodies traumatized in coltan mines and sweatshops retrieves those bodies, allows the possibility of mourning them, of witnessing their loss. More banally, sufficiently acknowledging that the moving image is constituted by a procession of lifelessness, that the moving image is an illusion, finds simultaneously intestinal coils of celluloid, for example, and the ideological engine behind that illusion. Mourning might best be thought of as a way of properly tracking and acknowledging loss, whether in death or knowledge or empathy or truth. Suddenly the camera is visible in the mirror. The VHS tracking remains permanently, deliberately unresolved, becomes rhythmic. Music and Foley buzz and keel and abruptly cut. A 3D creature clips impossibly through another 3D creature. The world and its representation are distinguished, and immanence evades narration. Melancholia transmutes into mourning, and real work can begin. Literality can only be a functionary of recouping the mortal when such recoupment relates to matter. So structuralist approaches to the moving image understand the difference between effect and material reality. By uncovering the workings, whether celluloid or shutter, one analogizes the uncovering of other realities. One repudiates illusions of all kinds by repudiating the illusion of the moving image. Making literal here flows into the figurative, while analogy and metaphor must appear in order for the act to mean beyond whatever microcosm that it's in. So the process is parabolic, requiring significant relation between, say, persistence of vision and propaganda. Fundamentally, both the structural and deconstructive methods require that there be a thing whose structure it is possible to expose. It subsequently requires that the illusion either remain or be put back in place to allow sufficient function to sustain critique. And really, a particular order of movement between literal and figurative is necessary for the structuralism to function. Certainly this pertains to the mortal analog, insofar as uncovering the workings of the living body means violence, or can better be described via a process of abjection. As regards the moving image, illusion is a condition of its being. A suspension of disbelief is a condition of its encounter, even if that suspension of disbelief is in turn suspended by the insistence of its partial dismantling for the sake of structural comprehension. In other words, the simultaneous and continued functioning of a structure with its surface, simultaneously observed, is essential to the reading, like understanding how a cat works by observing its innards while it continues to work, engine purring. If retrieving the lost object of a moving image technology lies in exposing its material reality, as well as the lives, processes, and politics that flow into a materiality deferred by the illusion that defines the medium, then acknowledging it is made possible by structural revelation simultaneous to continued function. Critically, this happens in a movement that is more or less against the desires of that technology. Insofar as this process is political, it also abounds of agency. Deconstructing the object confers a certain kind of freedom on the subject. Again, the literal is asserted in order to refound figuration. Figural to literal to figural, the lost object is acknowledged as lost in order to counter the neurotic consequences of repression and to begin a reparative move from melancholia to mourning. Mourning is mantric, inasmuch as it involves the naming of an object through the description of its absence, while literalization is equivalent to death, where both find their subject, retrieve them from the disbelief of a life of figuration, while affirming the absence of the very thing of which they affirm the finitude. Literalization renders loss, rather than the thing that was lost. Literalization describes the figurative as such. It delimits its existence by divulging its immanence. The literal is the end of language. And all of this is profoundly complicated by the digital. If technology's implicit desire is to disappear by a movement of natural progress, the digital pushes that figurative idea towards the literal. The digital cusps both figuration and literality, unmooring both, disrupting the ways in which the two might move between one another, be recognizable as one rather than the other. So digital technologies seem so fiercely figured and so wholly welcomed and afforded as a kind of ethical relief, the combination of which is surely most conspicuously capable of eroding the capacity to tell the difference between what is and what is not, or more opaquely, what is and what is also, with that also a kind of fine print of terms and conditions to unspool in great abject reports from far away and next door, to be scrolled blithely through in order to reach the I agree checkbox. So the confusion of literality and figuration means that the cloud remains a cloud, literally, while also operating as an image of a cloud, the one obliterating the conditions of the other, sending clouds, along with whatever acceded personal details, to some weird no place of fug and ignorance and clouds, literally. So the digital does not have literal analogues. To return to mourning and melancholia, the digital represses its lost object by literal figuration, and those neurotic symptoms that riddle the melancholic become a condition of the digital. Somewhere over there, countless acres of bunkered server farms wolf inestimable amounts of energy, overheating and strobing and duplicating and producing illusions that play out thousands of miles away, out of sight and out of mind. The unknown loss's symptomatic melancholia suffuses, and neurotic tics of shame and guilt play across faces quieted by an ignorance advanced by those impossible labyrinthine convolutions that constitute digital figuration and its disappeared literal structure. Losslessness abounds, and the mourning made possible by naming it, by affirming it in order to process it, is made figurative, literally. Writing this, I'm struck by the queasy clarity of my own neuroses, as well as their positive motility. How I've always wanted my videos to firstly be analogous to people, to bodies, to experience, and to loss. For my videos to stand as a kind of metaphysical surrogate for what I long for, the finite holism of a person's existence. So for years I rehearsed the idea that the videos I was making were dead men, albeit figuratively speaking, descended psychically from that literal dead man who began this whole mess for me. Making videos became about reparative mourning, though not therapy per se, extending outwards from mourning's most literal funereal wellspring to address a whole host of melancholic, neurotic attachments, transposing them into aspects of my life possible to be understood, if never importantly got. There is nothing of applicable use or value here at the wake. Most importantly, mourning intuits the moving image in a way that felt like forcible congruence at first, but which has expanded to encounter the structure of the medium, its effective modes, its burlesque of substance dualism, its striving for representational cogency. Immanence asserts the loop of every video that I make, circumscribes fidelity, and stands against losslessness. Loss is the sublime condition of any experience. I'm going to let this video play out, but thank you. Turn it up.